Welcome back, all. Yesterday we left off talking about Garrett Hardin's views on the tragedy of the commons and how that influences his views on things like world hunger and immigration. He snuck in towards the end of his article a suggestion that governments might license people to have children, or in some way have laws specifying how many children couples can have. Hardin takes it, as I said yesterday, as this is not to him a terribly controversial idea, but today we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And we're going to see how it is that Margaret Battin responds to it. Battin is pretty directly, I don't know if she has Hardin specifically in mind, but she is pretty specifically responding to people on his side. So let's get a little bit of a handle on the contours over the past couple hundred years of the thinking that informs Hardin whenever he says or defends positions like overpopulation is the most serious problem that faces the human race, and that all the problems of human societies ultimately can be traced back. Just about all the problems that we face can be traced back to overpopulation. So this constitutes this people with this attitude, the attitude that overpopulation is the most important issue. Constitutes one major line of thinking in the environmentalist movement. People who really are really concerned about the environment, really concerned about the future of the human race. And Battin wants to address these people. The one group she wants to address. These people she calls the Neo-Malthusians. Right, which is a very fun name. Sounds like an alien race on Star Trek, right? But where does this word Neo-Malthusian come from? Well, Neo means new, and Malthusian refers to Thomas Malthus, who was a philosopher and early sociologist, right? He wrote so let's talk a little bit about Thomas Malthus. It is Malthus's work who is going to inspire a lot of the concern about overpopulation in the centuries that follow him. Malthus is writing, and he publishes a seminal article in 1798, and it's called The Principle of Population. So let's very quickly go through what Malthus proposed in The Principle of Population and why it's so concerning to people like Hardin. So the idea of the principle of population is actually real simple. Malthus starts out by observing that, adult human couples tend to have more children than it takes to replace them, right? We're familiar with there being two people in a couple, right? Two people in the couple tend to have more than two children, right? It would take two children to replace people. But people tend to have more than two children. Let's say they have 4 children. And that will look like this. So there is a happy couple, and they have, let's say, 4 children. Now, these children, of course, have the same tendency, and let's say that they all have 4 children as well, right? Right. So now I will just have circles. Right. And see how very quickly we have gone from just one couple to a whole bunch, right? And this is a relatively small amount of time we're talking about here. I mean, between these children being born, between this couple having children, and the children being of of age where they can have their own children, we're only talking about 20 or 30 years, right? So over the course of just a 60-year period, you can go through 3 generations here and go from 2 people to, now imagine all these children down here also have the same tendency, and they all have 4 children. You've gone from 2 people to, I'll spare you the math, a lot, right? In less than a century, right? So what's the problem here? Well, already you might have an intuition of what the problem might be, but now let's talk about a concept that we introduced yesterday. We talked about Hardin, the idea of carrying capacity, right? Carrying capacity, remember, is the population that an environment can sustain or can renewably sustain, right? So whether we're talking about land or we're talking about a lake or whatever it is we're talking about, there is some number of organisms, of people, whatever, birds, fish, whatever, that can live on that land sustainably, right, without overpopulating. And if you get overpopulated, nature shrinks your number down to the number that it can sustain, right? So the problem that Malthus pointed out is that the carrying capacity of the land doesn't change that much, right? So let's say that this is the land that the family lives on. This is the family farm, right? And let's say that the carrying capacity of the family farm is 50 people, right? Now, when mom and dad move in here, they think, well, look at this giant farm. Look at how, and this is going to support as big a family as we could ever create, right? And after 1 generation, it's okay. And after 2 generations, you're pushing it. And after 3 generations, they have to move away because they can't be sustained by the farm anymore, right? Now, it would be one thing if every generation the carrying capacity of the land went up. But Malthus, one of the keys to Malthus's observations here is that it's really, really hard to get the carrying capacity of land to move up at all, right? And you might be, with different farming techniques and different fertilizers and whatever, you might be able to increase the carrying capacity of the land a little bit, right? But generally speaking, that number remains fixed, right? Right. At best, maybe, at best, maybe it increases what he calls mathematically, right? Which it increases by just a little bit. You just add a little bit. So let's say that it goes up to 75 and then 100, right? It's going to increase by 25 every time, right? Or every generation. Well, nonetheless, that number is not moving as quickly as this number, right? So now imagine that instead of talking about our family farm and just one family, we're talking about the human race, and we're talking about the total carrying capacity of the entire planet Earth, right? Now, those numbers would be way, way bigger, of course, but the same phenomenon persists. The carrying capacity of the entire planet Earth isn't moving much. Maybe instead of 50, it's 10 billion or 20 billion or 30 billion, right? Maybe it's some very, very large number, and we're not going to have to worry about the real crunch of overpopulation for 2 generations, 3 generations, 5 generations. Malthus's observation, though, is it's inevitable. It's going to happen sooner or later. There's only one way for this story to end, and the way that the story ends is that someday the population exceeds the carrying capacity. And if instead of, over here we're talking about just a farm and people can move off the farm, but if instead we're not talking about a local farm, we're talking about the entire planet Earth, there's no place to move. I mean, Elon Musk thinks we can go to Mars, right? But there's no place to move to get away from this population explosion. Once this bomb goes off on the entire planet Earth, there's going to be nowhere to go, right? Now, what does Malthus propose? Well, Malthus actually has very modest ideas in his own time. He thought that people who read and understood this argument ought to voluntarily choose to have fewer children, right, or no children. And that people who understand that, okay, well, hey, my neighbor is having 8 kids. Well, the way to offset that is for a lot of people to start having 0 kids, right? So that's what Malthus proposed in his own time. Eventually, people who read his argument and are inspired by his argument to be very, very afraid of the future of the human race because of overpopulation, eventually they begin to propose other sorts of solutions, right? So before we get to that, let me give you some notes on Malthus. Okay, so let's talk about the notes for this part. So Malthus is the principle of population. Human couples tend to have more children than needed to replace them. These children have the same tendency. Natural resources are limited by productive capacity, though. So population grows much faster than the ability of society to create resources. And you can add, I ran out of room here, we can add as the final note here that Malthus predicts that human populations are going to face mass famine, if not extinction, because of this. Eventually, we are going to face a situation where all of a sudden we have too many people and not enough resources. And I'm going to emphasize that because this is a very, very important issue to people like Malthus and Hardin, who's going to be in this tradition. That we tend to think that, well, hey, let's say the total carrying capacity of the planet Earth is some big number, like 20 billion people. We're now at, like, I think about 7 or 8 billion people on the planet Earth. So, we got some time to worry about what we're going to do, right? We have some time to become alarmed, right? The problem is, a lot of the neo-Malthusians point out, the problem is that we have, our intuitions don't work well with numbers like this. That, remember, Malthus said the population is growing at this rate that it is really frightening and is likely to just sort of smack us in the face. And the resources aren't going, they aren't improving at all. The carrying capacity isn't moving, right? Battin points out that one metaphor that the neo-Malthusians, or thought experiment the neo-Malthusians often sort of emphasizes this, that imagine you have a lake and there's a moss growing on the lake, right? And the size of the moss doubles every day, right? So here's your lake, and here's your little patch of moss, right? And the moss is growing at a rate that every day it doubles, right? And it's growing at a rate that every day it doubles, and also that at the end of 30 days it will have just covered the entire the entire pond, right? So now ask yourselves, on day 29, how much of the lake is covered? Well, it doubles every day at a rate such that at the end of 30 days, the entire lake will be covered. So you would think, intuitively, you would think, well, at the end of 29 days, most of the lake would be covered, right? But the Malthusians say, no, you're wrong. You're to hell with your intuitions. At the end of 29 days, half the lake is covered, right? So if the moss represents the ticking time bomb of population growth, then our intuitions tell us, yeah, by the time we have to worry about that, that's going to be a long way away, and by the time we really begin to feel it, we're going to have plenty of time to do something about it. And the Neo-Malthusians point out, no, by the time we start to feel it, it's already going to be too late. It's going to blow up in our faces. And there's no way to, for the Neo-Malthusians, there's no way to exaggerate the dangers of this. This is the end, literally the end of the world. If we all of a sudden have too many people and not enough resources, then it's going to be a mad scramble for the food. It's going to be a Hobbesian state of nature, right? We're all going to be killing each other. It's going to be like it's going to be like a Mad Max movie, right? Actually, there's a movie and a book from 2008. Well, the movie came out in 2008. The book came out previously, called The Road. The book was by Cormac McCarthy. The movie starred Viggo Mortensen and Charlize Theron. Anyway, it's pretty good. It's both a good book and a good movie. But that represents the kind of apocalypse that people like Hardin are imagining. In The Road, there is some sort of catastrophic environmental events that renders all food inedible. Right, the plants are all dying, all the meat is poisoned, right, and so it's this sort of post-apocalyptic scenario, and all you can do is travel the countryside looking for canned goods and trying to avoid roving packs of cannibals, right, because you're still edible, right. So and this is the kind of environmental catastrophe and the results. And the apocalyptic results that people like Hardin are imagining. And if that's what you're imagining, if that's what is tangible to you, and you think that you can, that's going to exist, maybe possibly within your own lifetime or the lifetime of your children or grandchildren, then you might think, well, then we need to, by any means necessary, try to prevent that bad outcome. We need to do whatever we can right now, as soon as possible, to prevent that, right? And that might mean doing some things that seem pretty unsavory, pretty bad. It might mean doing things like telling people how many children they can have. It might require doing things like sterilizing people forcibly, right? There might be things like maybe we have to kill a certain, we have a lottery, and if you win, you're executed, right, to get rid of you before you can be of breeding age, right? All of these are things that have been proposed in one tone of voice or another by people who have entered into this debate since the 1970s, right? So you have on one side, you have these neo-Malthusians. These people think that the most serious problem facing the human race is overpopulation, and by any means necessary, we need to try to get a handle on the population, on the ticking population bomb, even if that means infringing or violating people's human rights, individual rights. Most people, I take it, most people think that deciding how many children you want to have is a kind of fundamental human right. And the neo-Malthusians are saying, well, I don't care if it's a human right. It has to. It's not as your individual rights are not as important as the future of the human race, right? So that represents one of the two camps that Margaret Battin is writing about today. Battin says that she is writing to try to negotiate a peace between two sides on this issue. On the one hand, we have the neo-Malthusians. Pause this, not waste your time. Okay, so on the one side of this issue, these are the two sides of the issue. On the one side, you have the neo-Malthusians. These are the people who think that population control measures are justified, even if this means using force to keep people from reproducing, right, and violating human rights. On the other side, you have people who are worried about those human rights that might be violated by these measures. Battin thinks specifically the people who are the group that is speaking the loudest in opposition to these sorts of measures are the feminists, right? People who are worried about women's rights. And the feminist point is this, that these population control measures, the facts on the ground are the population control measures that are suggested by neo-Malthusians disproportionately hit women, or disproportionately hurt women. And disproportionately hurt women, especially in disadvantaged countries, right, in poorer countries. To understand this point, now let's talk about specifically some measures that, some of the more serious measures that have been proposed by neo-Malthusians to try to curb population growth. There are a whole variety of them, as I talked about. These are bouncing around a lot of the environmental literature and the conferences in the 1970s. You see all sorts of suggestions. Again, maybe the government ought to license people to have children. Then they could directly control it that way. Maybe there ought to be some sort of lottery where people, if you win, you're sterilized or something like that, right? The suggestion that ends up being taken the most seriously, of course, is that maybe the government could enact some sort of legislation that would limit couples to having one child, right? And the country that takes this the most seriously, beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, is China, right? China faces a population explosion in the 1970s, and before they are a great example of a government that is really taking the neo-Malthusian arguments very, very seriously around 1980, right? They are not yet quite feeling the day-to-day pinch of their population explosion, but they're realizing that, wow, we are very quickly overpopulating, right? And also, in 1980, within the lifetime of a lot of Chinese people at that time, they can remember periods in the 1930s and the 1940s where there were very, very serious famines, like horrible famines throughout the countryside in China for a variety of reasons. And so that's the memory of that, the sort of collective memory of all of that weighs heavily on their mind. They don't want it. They were coming through a period of time where their society was getting a little, the resources were getting a little more stable, and they don't want to go back to that, right? So in the early 1980s, China enacts this one-child policy, right, to try to curb their population growth, right? Well, so even if we think that the intentions of the government at that time were good, the results of that one-child policy were controversial, to say the least, and some would say catastrophically terrible. Most feminist writers would say catastrophically terrible, because of course it's one thing for the government to say, okay, well, you can have exactly one child, married couples. It's another thing for them to A, enforce that, and B, change the culture surrounding, change the cultural attitudes about gender in that society, right? So in the first case, for a variety of reasons in Chinese society at that time, and maybe to some degree today, I don't know, I'm not an expert. Certainly at that time, the male children were valued more than female children, right? One tangible, practical reason for that is that it was assumed the male child goes and has a career, and then that's your retirement plan. The male child having a career and making some money is the only way that you're going to live into your, he's going to take care of you in your old age, right? If you can only have one child and that child turns out to be a girl, that sends your future into a tailspin, right? So there's immediately a problem in China, especially in poorer parts of the nation where people are more and more, or even are more concerned about their futures as old people, right? There's immediately a problem with, people having a child, and then if that child is female, either abandoning the child, or maybe you throw the child in the river, and it didn't happen, right? There was a documentary that came out a couple years ago called One Child Nation. If you're interested in this issue, I recommend that. They describe some of the extremes of what's happening in the 1980s in rural parts of China. You can drive through. Man describes having a paper route at that time and riding through town, and on every block you can hear abandoned children just screaming, right? Yes, and we're not just talking about children, of course. We're also talking about girl children specifically, right? So furthermore, not just abandoned children, but also the documentary gets into that the chief way of enforcing this rule is that the federal government in China divvies up a certain amount of resources for the little local villages, and the little local villages then are responsible for enforcing these laws. And if they have more children in their village than is allowed, then their funding gets cut. And that can be a matter of life and death for a lot of these little villages, right? So it's left up to these little villages to decide for themselves how they're going to enforce these rules. And that, of course, leads to all sorts of really gory kind of backwoods kind of solutions to some of these problems, including forced abortions, right? Yeah, check out that documentary. Anyway, FYI, China relaxed the one-child policy a few years ago. A couple generations on, the bad results of this policy were just too awful to ignore. About 20 years ago, it really began to sink in that, oh wait, they basically wiped out a generation of girls, right? And this was shown by the fact that you have, by the late 1990s, you have way more men of marrying age than you have Chinese women of marrying age. Anyway, and that's just one example of the best example of a population control measure being installed because of the hue and cry of people like Hardin and the Neo-Malthusians, and the negative results generally for human beings, but specifically for women, right? That these policies lead to female infanticide, they lead to forced abortions, they lead to women being hurt the most, right? So the feminist view on this is that controlling population really means controlling women. That if you tell some country, or you put pressure on some country to control their population, the measures that they're going to enact, because of the ways that a lot of these patriarchal societies are constructed, the measures that they enact are inevitably going to fall on women and inevitably going to hurt women more than they hurt men, right? So, okay, so that is the diagnosis. So what is the cure? Well, Margaret Battin thinks that she has a solution that can make both sides of this split happy. She thinks that her solution is going to make the Neo-Malthusians happy because her solution is immediately going to eliminate as many as 30% of births in a society, and it's going to make the feminists happy because Battin says that the Battin plan not only does it not hurt women, it actually gives women more control over their reproductive futures. So let's talk about the Battin plan. Okay, so to talk about the Battin plan, we need to talk about a couple of terms she uses. In the first case, she talks about the default mode of human reproduction. The default mode of human reproduction is just a philosopher's way of saying describing the natural conditions where sex tends to lead to pregnancy, right? We all know, hopefully, by college age, that the sex act is what leads women to be pregnant. It's not a stork. So the default mode is the natural state where you expect that engaging in sexual activity, one possible result of that will be a pregnancy, right? So Battin says, however, we have the technology to change that default mode. We have the technology to make it such that we could be having sex and nobody expects that pregnancy will result. We would do this, of course, with some sort of birth control, right? She talks about how there is as needed birth control. There's birth control that you use as you're getting ready to make a more, right? And there is also birth control like the pill, or like in the modern era, the Depo-Provera shot, right? That you just get and you don't use it as needed. If you do, you're doing it wrong. You take it regularly, and you just create an ongoing state where you are not fertile, right? So Battin thinks that if we use that technology, and if we keep developing new technologies to do that, what we could eventually have is a situation where beginning at a young age, say the age of sexual maturity, beginning with girls, because it's just a fact, the scientific fact now is that we have the technology to affect the fertility of women in a way that we don't yet quite with men. With women, it's a lot less intrusive. I mean, there are ways with men, but those require some surgery, right? So beginning at a young age, every young person, or beginning at the age of sexual maturity, every young person will be expected to take the pill or get the shot or whatever it takes to render them render them infertile, right? And that then it would not be expected through your teen years or even into your adulthood. It would not be expected that any sexual activity you engage in will lead to pregnancy, right? The idea then is that at some age later on, whenever the person decides, hey, I'd like to start a family, they either stop taking the pills or they go in and get the antidote shot or whatever, and then they have a child. They get pregnant, or wife gets pregnant, man helps, right? And then after you're done with that, then you take the pill again or get the shot again, and you are back to not expecting that sex leads to pregnancy, right? Battin imagines, she's writing this back in 1985. She understands that back when she's writing it, we're having to imagine a having to engage in a little science fiction. We're having to imagine a different kind of alternative or a different kind of drug. It has to be something that's long acting. She's imagining, I think, something like some of the modern shots that women can get, like the Depo-Provera shot, that can render them infertile for a year, or I think even like 18 months now, or even more, right? So this is exactly the kind of thing that Battin has in mind, right? Battin doesn't mention this, but we're also, for the purposes of our discussion here, let's just say that it's going to be let's imagine a alternative that has no serious side effects and that doesn't render anybody permanently unable to have children. Okay, because the next step is that Battin thinks that, well, not only can we do this, but we have to then begin to adopt an attitude that this is expected, right? She thinks that we all need to do this. We need to make it a social and maybe a legal requirement. People do this for their children, and that people keep doing whatever it takes to maintain this, right? Or to maintain their infertility, right? So, okay. So the Battin plan then is to use long-acting reversible birth control to change the default mode of human reproduction. If we do this, Battin says, there are two results, right? One, this makes the neo-Malthusians happy, that as many, even in a society like the United States, where we all have ready access to birth control, and you have a variety of options, right? Even so, as many as 30% of the births in the United States are unplanned, right? So Battin thinks immediately, if we enact this plan and we do it successfully, immediately we can say goodbye to that. There will be no unplanned pregnancies if this plan is enacted well, and that's going to make the neo-Malthusians happy, because that's going to reduce the birth rate by as much as 30%. So they say yay, right? On the other hand, the feminists ought to be happiest of all about this. There are a whole variety of issues affecting the health of women that would be conceivably helped by this plan, right? First of all, you can say goodbye to most abortions, right? Most abortions and the anxiety that accompanies them, the choices that accompany them. Most abortions happen because of an unplanned pregnancy, right? And if we say goodbye to unplanned pregnancies, most abortions are going to go away, right? You also are not going to have women, ancillary to that is you're not going to have 16-year-olds women having to choose between continuing to go to school or having a baby if they find themselves pregnant, right? You can say goodbye to most pregnancies as a result of rape, right? Now there might still be some weird cases where you on your way home from the doctor where you got the shot and now you're fertile, you're attacked, right? So there might be very, very rare cases like that. But generally speaking, pregnancies that result from rape happen because the woman happened to be raped when she was fertile, right? And if your default mode is infertility, then that's not going to happen. Battin points out that this is going to eliminate a lot of issues of paternity, right? Of course, now we have DNA, so that's not an issue anymore. Well, I mean, we had DNA in the 80s. We just didn't have reliable testing, right? So Battin thinks this makes both sides of this issue happy. This makes the neo-Malthusians happy because it will stem the birth rate, and it makes feminists happy because it will actually end up giving women more control over their reproductive lives, right? So we need to make it mandatory, whatever that means. We'll talk about that in a second. We need to make it mandatory that all parents, when their child is of reproductive age, take that child to the doctor, use whatever long-acting reversible birth control technology is available to render that child infertile for some period of time, and it needs that will reap all of these wonderful benefits, right? So why aren't we doing this? You know, this article is almost 40 years old now, right? So what's the problem? Well, let's talk about the problems. Okay, so Battin thinks to ensure the justice of this plan, to try to head off any unintended consequences of this plan, we need to make sure right off the bat that there are two conditions in place. The first condition that's in place is, however this plan is enacted, it needs to be clear from the start that this is going to be these measures are going to be expected of everyone in the society. That it's not going to be that certain people are expected to do this, but certain other kinds of people aren't. It has to be universal. It has to be expected of everyone, right? The reasons for this that Battin wants this is clear, or ought to be clear. If you know anything about the unsavory history of eugenics in the United States, then you might suspect that a condition like this needs to be in place. If it's expected of everyone, if it's not expected of everyone, then some people are expected to do it and some people aren't, and we might then begin to target socially or legally certain groups that we decide we want fewer of in our society, right? For instance, if there are, if poor or indigent or if poorer people, indigent, there's a word I'm looking for. If poor people are expected to do this, but rich people aren't, then eventually you're going to have lower birth rates among the poor and higher birth rates among the rich, and that's a kind of economic eugenics. I mean, that's a kind of economic sort of selecting this group of people and phasing out or some other group of people, right? Of course, we can play that same game racially. If there's some racial group that the society decides they want fewer of, then it can be expected of that group, but not expected of the majority group, right? So we don't want any of that. We don't want this to turn into some sort of nefarious social engineering program. So it has to be expected of everyone. How do you do that? Well, we'll get to that later. So in the second case, Battin says that it must be reversible. I mean, we already talked about how these measures are obviously going to be reversible. We don't want to permanently sterilize anybody. But it has to be reversible on demand. That we can't attach any conditions to a person, or especially a woman, deciding, okay, I would like to have a child now, so I'm going to stop taking this drug, or I'm going to, or I want the antidote to reverse it, right? Any conditions we put on it is interfering with people's ability to choose for themselves when they want to start a family, and what happens. Interfering with people's ability to choose what they do with their own bodies, right? We still need having children to be a natural part of life, and if there's any sort of impediment or any sort of interference with that on behalf of a government or a homeowners association or anything like that, then we've injected some sort of authoritarian presence into what is a basic, fundamental, natural part of human life, right? And Battin doesn't want to do that. So The two conditions to ensure the justice of the plan is it must be expected of everyone, and it must be reversible on demand. That is, there are no conditions for fertility. There are no. You don't have to prove that you're married. You don't have to prove that you can pay for another child. We can't say, oh, well, you already have 3 children. You can't have another one. There's not going to be anybody. There's not going to be any sort of governmental agency who dictates that kind of thing, because we still want having children to be a natural part of human lives, and we don't want the government sticking its nose in that, right? Okay, so back to the question I asked a little bit ago. Maybe this it sounds like everybody's happy here. The neo-Malthusians are happy, the feminists are happy, so who's unhappy with this plan? Well, obviously a lot of people of any sort of religious stripe are not going to be happy with this plan. So let's already talk about that. There's a third very important voting block left out of this little argument, or this little discussion here. And there are an awful lot of people in the United States and elsewhere who, for a variety of reasons, generally religious, they object to birth control in most forms, right? Here in, Catholics, for instance, think that, are generally opposed to all forms of birth control, right? And that's just one part of the many religious groups that would oppose this plan on the grounds that they just don't want to be, they don't want to have birth control. They don't want to have birth control for their children. They don't want to be pressured in one way or another to take part in this. They don't want any part of that. Here in the United States, it's not easy to, or it's pretty easy to imagine the hue and cry that would go up if any sort of politician would suggest this as a national policy to deal with overpopulation. People would freak out. Yeah. So that's the major, that's the major thing that leaves Battin's plan, again, as more of an exercise, and it's more of a thought experiment than a serious policy proposal. But it is fun to think about. Well, what are the philosophically, if we don't have any problem with birth control, as in theory, what are the complications with this plan? What do we think the problems are, right? I think there's one philosophical problem right on the surface of Battin's plan here, and that is how exactly you pressure people into having this done to themselves and to their children, if they are otherwise not particularly partial to it, right? So it must be, remember, to ensure justice, it must be expected of everyone, and it must be reversible on demand. Well, how do we make it so that everybody does it? Well, Battin has a couple of ideas here of varying force. She says, well, it might be as easy as putting pressure on people to have this done whenever their child enters into middle school, in the same way that you get your child booster shots and vaccines. Put aside the controversy over vaccines for a second. But there was a time when getting your child, especially an older child, booster shots was considered a necessary part of entering into, 6th grade or whatever, and that the schools would require it, that if your child doesn't have if you don't have proof that your child's had these certain shots, then you can't enter the public school at 6th grade, right? And Battin thinks, well, it might be as easy as doing it that way. We might just put some requirements that, hey, your child has to have had this procedure done, or this, or has to have been given this medication to ensure, X number of years or whatever of infertility, right? And then it's just a requirement, and people just do it. And then attached to that would be a sense of social responsibility. That, well, you're just a bad parent if you don't. You're just being an irresponsible citizen and an irresponsible parent if you don't have this done, right? So we can think of that as sort of the kind of softer ways that Battin proposes that we enact this. She also she engages in a little bit of speculation about that there might be more heavy-handed tactics that are used. And the government might actually punish you in some way if you don't offer proof that you've had this procedure done to your children, or that your children had access to these drugs, right? And I think the problem I see here is that I don't have a lot of faith that the softer tactics are going to work on the scale that Battin thinks they're going to do, or thinks they're going to work. And already you have a I think actually the second condition here prevents us from engaging in any of the more heavy-handed tactics, right? So it must be expected of everyone. You must do it, but also you can have it reversed on demand. So what, you're forced to go to the doctor to have it put in, and then as soon as he puts it in, you say, okay, we'll take it out, right? I mean, probably what Battin has in mind here is that the real target population of this, I guess, is going to be, kids between the ages of 12 and 17, right? Now, if you can enact this with them, then they can, you would take a bite out of the birth rate for sure, right? We're all familiar with the phenomenon of teen pregnancy, right, and teen hormones. But anything, and so maybe if you have a child and the child's under 18 and you are the parent and you have control over that child's medical situation, then maybe you can basically force them to do it. And then I guess if you're under 18, you aren't allowed to reverse it on demand, right? So maybe that's what she has in mind, and I guess that would work. Although that still seems to be incurring upon people's autonomy, just on the allowing us to incur the state to incur on people's sexual autonomy, just using the kind of loophole that, oh well, you're not 18 yet, right? And I don't know, maybe that's good. I mean, it seems good if you're an adult. It probably seems bad if you're a 16-year-old who wants to get pregnant, right? Yeah. So anyway, fun to think about. So
did you do a password?
I did not do a password. Thanks to thank you to my assistant. So the password for tonight is Beth, my wife's name. My wife's name is Beth, and that's the password for tonight. So thank you, Beth. Thank you all for hanging in there, and I will talk to you next time.